Get ready to hear some timeless historical radio broadcasts. Thank you for visiting Golden Age Radio. Listen to the complete NBC and CBS D-Day broadcasts on rebel.com/C/GAR. Support our veterans by visiting veteransradioministry.com. Let's honor their sacrifice. Thank you.
It's 11:30 a.m. Eastern Wartime. This is WEAF, New York.
It's time for Brave Tomorrow, a story of love and courage. Written for you by Ruth Adams Knight.
And brought to you by the makers of Ivory Flakes.
Tomorrow. Life requires courage. Out of the challenge of today, we build our brave tomorrow. On the road which leads to the famous Bar H Ranch, there has been a tragic accident. But unaware of that, Jim Holland is awaiting the arrival of his three guests. Courtney Blaine, who is coming to write an article about his job. Marty Lambert, who is coming to escape from the emotional problems which have been torturing her 17-year-old soul. And Louise Lambert, who has seen in this visit a resumption of her acquaintance with Jim Holland and her first relief from boredom since the quarrel with her husband Hal, which resulted in her staying on for a time in Dustville. Leaning on the corral fence, Jim is talking to Steve, his foreman.
I hope you won't mind all these visiting females too much, Steve. I promise to keep them out of your hair.
Well, if we've got to have them, I'll put up a brave front. Sure don't see any sense in it, though, boss.
You know there are people in this world who've never been on a Texas ranch, Steve?
I don't believe it. What are they living for?
Waiting for the chance, I guess. Well, they're all pretty sensible women, Steve. They won't give you any trouble.
Scream at snakes?
Well, maybe. But not at spiders.
Ride?
English saddle.
Gee, Horsepath. We wouldn't have an English saddle on the place.
Oh, they're going to learn cowboy fashion. One of the ladies is very young and pretty, Steve.
Female age and looks don't interest me one way or the other. I'll be polite to them if you say so.
I most certainly do say so.
What's the matter with the other two?
Not a thing. They're both charming. Miss Blaine may ask you a lot of questions about the ranch.
One of those inquiring dames, is she?
Well, she's writing an article
About the ranch?
about transporting food for the government.
Oh, your job. Well, hope she appreciates how good you are.
Forget to mention it to her, will you, Steve? Just as a favor.
How could she write an article if she don't know anything?
Well, what I mean is, soft peddle of personal stuff. She can write all she wants to about the number of pounds of beef it takes to feed an army, but I don't want anything dropped about the white felt hats I wear or the pipes I smoke.
Or the dames that think you're a motion picture cowboy.
Yeah, if you let any of that foolishness drop.
Okay, boss. I'm mum as an oyster.
They might want to go out on a pack trip.
You got it bad, haven't you?
What do you mean?
Taking time out to convoy a bunch of women on a pack trip. I never thought I'd see the day.
I told you, Steve, I'm tired. Too tired to do my job. Getting out on the ranch is the only thing that helps when I find I'm groggy, adding up figures.
And for Pete's sake, go be yourself. Nobody ever got any rest with a woman along, boss. Nobody.
Well, I'll see. I suppose if this place ever had a real Mr. Steve, you'd just start off down the road and never come back.
This place with
Yes.
a real mistress?
Yes.
You wouldn't be thinking of that, would you?
I might someday. I've lived out here alone a long time.
Alone?
Yes.
You got me, ain't you? You got the best bunch of cowhands in the Southwest. You got Emmy to keep house for you. What more could you want?
I don't know. I never thought a man wanted anything more, but lately, Steve, I've considered the matter of getting married.
Yeah. Boss, you just ain't.
Well, nothing definite, you understand. I wouldn't even dare think about it until I have your blessing.
Well, you sure ain't got it, nor any prospects.
Do you mean you wouldn't like it?
Wouldn't like it. Now, listen. I've been foreman here for you ever since you was a buck and colt, Mr. Holland. I run this place for you like I run it for your father before you. He's old enough to take over yourself. I'm going right on doing it, too. Putting up with all your newfangled notions, letting you bring in all sorts of fancy stock no regular ranchman ever heard of.
But they've done all right, haven't they?
Yeah, done all right, but it ain't legitimate. It ain't according to rules. But I stood for it. Sometimes I think the place looks more like a museum than a ranch. I'm taking care of everything for you since you went galloping off to the wars, too.
I know you have. I owe you more than I can ever say, Steve.
You owe me nothing. Only don't go bringing any females onto the place to stay or I'm through.
Well, of course, if you feel that strongly about it.
You got ideas about one of these coming down here today?
Oh, this is business, Steve. And an attempt to give a lady a little vacation out of Dustville.
She's staying there. She needs one, all right.
So, you be nice to them all, Steve, will you?
You won't double-cross me? Get to imagine you're sweet on any one of them.
I'm much too old and fond of my own ways for that, Steve.
They say those are just the ones. It seemed to me if you was going to get the marrying craze, you'd have had it a lot earlier.
Like measles? Maybe I would have. I've just always seemed too busy for romance. Too much work to be done.
Best break you ever had. I suppose you want me to round up a flock of rocking horses.
Yeah, three nice, gentle animals, please. I'll leave it to you.
Well, I'll go out after 'em, if you say so, but I'd never thought you'd come to this, boss. If you ask me, it'd been a lot better if you hadn't.
Jim Holland comes slowly up from the corral toward his ranch house, set in a clump of scrubby trees and looking cool and inviting. The path near the house is bordered with cactus. The scarlet blossoms are flame against the grayness of the landscape and the vivid blue of the sky. Jim looks at the scene and draws a deep breath, a breath of utter happiness at the sudden sight of the beauty of this land he loves so sometimes gives him. Steve is right, he thinks. This is his home, his life, his family. He needs nothing more. Not even the companionship of a delicate, feminine woman like Louise Lambert. Not even the gracious loveliness of Courtney Blaine. And yet, Jim Holland has to admit that the prospect of their coming has shaken him out of his usual well-disciplined routine. He enters the house and goes out into the great ranch kitchen where Emmy, his cook, presides in undisputed authority. At the moment, Emmy stands at the stove stirring the bubbling contents of a huge kettle. As Jim Holland enters, she looks up and says,
"What time you expect this company of yours, Mr. Holland?"
I don't know exactly. He'll have to drive slowly, of course.
"Yes. Well, I got the guest rooms all fixed up ready for 'em.
Good.
Gave 'em the ones on the west side, off the balcony, like you said.
Oh, that's fine, Emmy, fine. I want you to take good care of them.
I'll take care of 'em all right. It'll do me good to cook for quality ladies a while. After all the fine eating I waste on these cowboys.
No, I always appreciate your cooking, Emmy. Never wasted on me.
Oh, half the time you don't know what you're putting in your mouth. Well, I got little old pies out there cooling now. I'm planning to give 'em a big roast.
Oh, that's fine, Emmy. Thank you very much. Well, I'll let you know as soon as they arrive.
Mr. Holland.
Yeah?
Is there...
Yes, Emmy?
Is there one of these ladies that's extra special?
Why, no, Emmy. There's a lady and a daughter, and the third one is a writer getting material for a story.
Oh.
Why?
Nothing. I was just hopeful.
Hopeful? About what?
Mr. Holland, every time I looks at you, I think, now, why in creation ain't that man gone and got married a long time ago like he oughta?
Well, you and Steve ought to come to some sort of agreement. He's violently opposed to any such idea.
Much as he knows. You ought to have a home, Mr. Holland.
What do you call this?
But this is just the makings. No place is a real home till it's got a woman what loves you in it.
Well, I'm afraid this one will have to wait quite a while, Emmy. We've got a war to win first, you know.
Well, after the war, Mr. Holland, you're going to put your mind to getting married then.
After the war?
Yes.
I don't know. It's hard for any of us to know what we'll do, Emmy. After the war.
There's that telephone again. Been ringing like that all morning.
I'll get it, Emmy. I'm going in. Give us a nice dinner now.
Oh, you trust Emmy.
Yes, okay. Don't get excited. Hello.
Boy, Ranch.
Yeah?
Mr. Jim Holland.
This is Jim Holland.
Mr. Holland, you expecting some guests today? 3 ladies driving out from Dustville?
That's right. What about who is this?
This is State Troop North. I'm sorry to have to inform you that there's been an accident.
What kind of an accident?
Well, their car went off the road, tipped over at the bridge turnoff.
Good heavens. Are they seriously hurt?
We don't know yet. The girl's conscious. She gave us your name. We're trying to get an ambulance, but there's none available at the moment. Mr. Holland.
Yes?
The wreck is much nearer to your ranch and to Dustville.
Yes?
Do you have any sort of wagon or truck you could bring? These women have got to be moved.
Of course. I'll be there as fast as I can get there. Emmy.
Yes, Mr. Holland, what's wrong with you?
Call Dustville. Say there's been an accident. Get Dr. Carter down here immediately. Tell him it's emergency.
Accident? Where's any accident?
I'm bringing the people here. Steve and I'll take the truck. Emmy, get me a mattress and blankets and something for bandages. Oh, and the first aid kit. And hurry up about it. Someone may be dying. Steve!
Yes, Emmy. Take the company dinner off the stove and get the bandages ready, and hurry. For a car lies overturned in the bottom of a Texas ditch, and someone may be dying. Louise Lambert or Courtney Blaine? Life requires courage. Out of the challenge of today, we build our brave tomorrow.
This is the National Broadcasting Company.
WEAF, New York.
Once again, we present David Harum, one of the most beloved stories of American fiction. For David Harum is America. It's the story of every one of us, of our search for love, for happiness, and the good way of life. Housewives who would like to save both time and money in cleaning will profit from this letter from a woman who is not...
The National Broadcasting Company interrupts all its programs to bring you a special broadcast. We take you now to London.
This is the advanced Allied command post of the invasion forces. Part of the amphibious forces which struck at France yesterday were manned by personnel of the United States Coast Guard. Covering them for the combined radio and press global pool was Mr. Tom Trainer, war correspondent of the Los Angeles Times. Mr. Trainer has just arrived at the command post from France after landing on the beachhead with the American Army units that the Coast Guard delivered into battle. He is here in the studio to give you his eyewitness report of the invasion. Mr. Trainer.
I've just returned from France after hitchhiking on 8 ships, mostly Coast Guard. Coast Guard craft seem to be all over the channel, snaking survivors out of the water, rushing wounded to first aid, and landing infantry and vehicles on the beach. I hit the beach myself early during D-Day when the Coast Guard cutter on which I was stationed went close ashore to pull aboard some men who had capsized in a duck. They came aboard shivering and shaking with cold, and as soon as they got below, proceeded to get seasick all over the place. I ceased interviewing them at this point and asked my skipper, Lieutenant Raymond Rosenblum of Baltimore, if he would hail a passing landing craft inward bound to the beach and put me aboard. The transfer was made, and my new skipper, Lieutenant Edward Raymond of Pittsburgh, said, "I don't think we can get in. It's all these obstacles that are messing the thing up before we even get to the beach." I couldn't see any obstacles. "That's the trouble," he said. "Neither can we. The tide is running high and they're covered. Those are heavy posts driven into the sand with booby traps attached. At low tide, we can avoid them. At high tide, you see," he pointed to various landing craft up and down the beach, which had been stove in and swung idly back and forth with the surf. "They got us," he said. We prowled up the coast a mile looking for an opening, and then heard a loud hail behind us. A sleek-looking patrol craft slid by, and the skipper shouted, "Hold off. Don't put your craft ashore until you get further orders." "Now what?" I asked Raymond. "We'll see if we can get you on something smaller," he said. He got out his loudhailer and called a landing craft personnel, which was heading into the beach. Motor machinist mate John Kramer of Albany, New York, and Seaman First Class Jack Whitney of Columbus, Ohio, took me aboard. "Okay," said Kramer to Whitney, "let's go and keep an eye out for the traps." We came sliding and slewing in on some light breakers and grounded. I stepped ashore on France, walking up a beach where men were moving casually about, carrying equipment inshore. Up the coast a few hundred yards, German shells were pounding in regularly, but in our area it was peacefully busy. "How did you make out?" I asked one of the men. "It was reasonably soft," he said. "The Germans had some machine gun posts and some high-velocity guns on the palisades and made it a little hot at first. They waited until the landing craft dropped their ramps, then opened up on them while the men were still inside. In a few cases, we took heavy casualties. Then the Navy went to work on the German guns, and it wasn't long before they were quiet." The general lack of fortifications at this point was astonishing. The barbed wire consisted of 4 single strands, such as we use at home to fence in cattle. A man could get through by pushing down on one wire and lifting up on another, providing they weren't booby-trapped. The engineers and beach battalions, however, had blown gaps in the wire through which we could move vehicles. A few dead lay about, and some wounded were here and there on stretchers awaiting transfer to ships at sea. All up and down the broad beach, as far as I could see, men, jeeps, bulldozers, and other equipment were moving about like ants. A few columns of black, greasy smoke marked equipment which had been hit by shell fire and set afire. The German shelling continued steadily at various points up and down the beach, but so far not reached the area in which I was walking. It would work over an area, then move on to another. It was accurate, landing for the most part close to the water's edge, and I saw one small landing craft catch fire after taking a hit. Men came spilling out of it into water waist deep. From time to time, there were huge concussions as the engineers set off demolitions. The ground would shake, and the troops would throw themselves violently on the ground. I climbed a rock embankment and came to a piece of flat land where hundreds of men were digging foot trenches. When they got down about 1.5 feet, they struck water. Some of them were lying in the water, and I asked if there was much shelling. There is when there is, one man said. Right now there isn't, but when it comes, it sure comes. I asked him what German fortifications he could point out. He showed me some tunnels at the top of the palisade. Palisade rises above the beach along this stretch of coast. There were five or six positions I could make out, nothing particularly formidable. I walked over to an aerial which seemed to mark a command post. A colonel and a major were sitting beside a split trench half filled with water, and I said to the colonel, "Sir, I'm a war correspondent." He looked up from a map fiercely, and the major said, "I think you'd better stop back later. You might try going up that path there where you see those men, if you can make it. Watch out for mines. It's heavily mined." A long column of men was winding up the palisade on a narrow path. They weren't moving. At the skyline, they seemed to be knotted up. To reach the palisade, I joined a column who were wading across a slough. The water came nearly to their armpits, and they had to hold their rifles and equipments over their heads. The water was rather warm, but the bottom was a slimy mess. When a man got to the far side of the slough, he would always stop in a maddening way, holding the rest of us up. We shouted angrily, but when we got there, each one of us stopped too. The reeds on the far bank were loaded with mines. One man lay at the top of the bank dead. The mines had been marked with bits of paper, and soldiers at the top advised just how to climb so as not to venture into dangerous ground. There were more dead men along the narrow path which led up the palisade. The column had stopped moving, and I began to step past men following a captain. Suddenly a voice said, "Watch yourself, fellow, that's a mine." A soldier sprawled on the bank was speaking. He had one foot half blown off. He'd stepped on a mine a short time earlier. Now, while he waited for litter bearers, he was warning other soldiers about other mines in that vicinity. I can stand the dead, but the wounded horrify me, and I only looked at him to thank him. He looked very tired, but perfectly collected. "What you need is the medics," I said. "I'll try and get them for you when I go back down." "Yeah," he said, "but how are they going to get up here?" He was right. The pathway was so clogged with men and so heavily mined that it was impassable. The engineers would have to get up there first. The column didn't move forward. The captain I was following stopped, and so did I. I asked him his name, and he said he was Louis Hilly of Cincinnati. "It looks like they shell around here a bit," I said, pointing to some shallow craters. "No," said Hilly, "those are all mines. That's why we're stuck on this path." We tried to edge a few feet further forward and came to a soldier lying in the path, curled around a mine. He said his name was Private Morton Soratello of the Bronx, and I asked him if it didn't make him nervous to be curled around a mine like that. "No," he said, "I just keep clear of it and pass the word on to those behind." Just ahead of him, Second Lieutenant Bernard Flynn of Springfield, Massachusetts, and Sergeant Arthur Brown of Brookfield, Maryland, were sitting in the immediate vicinity of mines, which they were calling to attention of all who passed. "It's all right, except when a shell comes in," Flynn said. "Then you're apt to forget and fall on the thing." While we were stopped there, a squib-like report sounded behind us. I thought it was a mortar going off, but Captain Hilly said it was a mine. He'd heard enough of them this day. At the top of the palisade, the knot of men had gotten to its feet, and it looked like the line might move. One man darted over the skyline, and almost immediately afterwards, we heard the speedy burst of a German machine gun. Then a few stray rifle shots. The bullets cracked overhead, and everyone instinctively ducked lower. These were some troops who had never seen combat before, and the bullets must have seemed close to them, although we were 100 feet below the skyline. The line remained stationary, and I looked down on the beach and the sea. Landing craft of all descriptions were sliding in through the low surf, disgorging men who moved through the water with amazing alacrity. As soon as they got ashore and saw the men moving about calmly, they seemed to steady down and began to walk quietly themselves. I waited a spell longer, and the line didn't move, so I began to make my way down the path again. It was slow work. The soldiers were so alarmed that I would step on a mine right next to them that one man told me to walk on his back rather than step off the path. I promised I would try and get the engineers up to disarm the mines. While I was going down the slope, the Germans began shelling our area. It was hard not to throw myself on the ground willy-nilly, but the thought of those mines kept me from it. The shells were still landing at some distance on the flat. I took a last look at the greatest armada in history before going on the flat. It was too immense to describe. There were so many transports on the horizon that in the faint haze they looked like a shoreline. Destroyers were almost on the beach, occasionally jolting out a salvo that was like a punch on the chin. Farther out, but still incredibly close to the beach, sat our huge battle wagons and cruisers. Overhead, formation there with nothing to do. During this entire day, I never saw a German plane nor spoke to a man who had seen one. I reached a small command post on the flat where a dispatch had just been handed two captains. It said that our troops were a mile inland, but we could still hear small arms fire. They were apparently being harassed by snipers, but so far it meant nothing heavy in the way of emplacements or an armored force. Just as I reached the beach, the German artillery came down in earnest. I dived into a split trench, but a man was in ahead of me, so I ducked under a bulldozer where I felt very safe. The only trouble was that I didn't want to get out from under the bulldozer after the shelling had stopped. The stuff was coming in close enough to send pebbles flying in, and I felt pretty badly shaken for a period. The first landing craft I boarded hung upon a sandbar. We had to unload and carry 5 stretcher cases through deep water to a second craft. Out in that great field of ships, it was like looking for a needle in a haystack to find my Coast Guard cutter. I never could locate it, but finally boarded another Coast Guard craft after transferring 3 times. Fortunately, it was the lead ship for the Coast Guard Rescue Flotilla, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Alexander Stewart of Mamaroneck, Long Island. We set off for England a few hours later, but a breakdown held us up, and we were 16 hours making the crossing. You have just heard an eyewitness report on the Coast Guard and American Army effort in the invasion beachhead by Mr. Tom Trainer, broadcasting.
You've been listening to Tom Trainer of the Los Angeles Times, acting as special reporter for the National Broadcasting Company with the U.S. Coast Guard. Now back to NBC in New York.
And here we are back in New York after hearing that exclusive NBC story by Tom Trainer of the Los Angeles Times. We now bring you a brief interlude of music.
WEAF New York for complete and timely news coverage. At 1:45 this afternoon, listen to Morgan Beatty reporting on the last-minute developments in the news.
This program will be interrupted whenever bulletins come into our NBC newsroom. Portions are recorded and transcribed. Well, we only need a downbeat to send us on our way and put our rhythm on the line to...
Beware of the moth. Public enemy number one. Silent, destructive, unsuspected.
You've all heard of Johnny Moth, who loves to eat fur coats and cloth. He spent the winter starving in a closet there.
Now summer season's coming, and the little moths are humming. For his cheap fur coats upon the bill of fare.
They will cost you many dollars. By consuming cuffs and collars, you'll have nothing but the buttonhole by fall.
If you're wise, then in a box you'll send your furs to I.J. Fox. For in their storage books they're safe until you call.
Caledonia 5 for 500. I.J. Fox Fur Storage.
It hits us round this time of year. We'd like to burst with song, so if you know these lyrics too, feel free to hum along.
Can sing like a bird.
Who?
She's the greatest find of this or any age.
Who?
Why, Jane Powell, of course, Charles Rogers' new sensational discovery. And he's the man who discovered Deanna Durbin. Can he pick 'em?
She's for me, then.
And for everybody. Jane Powell will sing her way into the hearts of America. She's lovely, she's young, she's enchanting. She's that sensational new find in Song of the Open Road, the year's best musical.
Oh, now I know. That grand picture with Charlie McCarthy and Edgar Bergen.
And W.C. Fields, no less.
And Sammy Kaye and his orchestra.
And Regis Toomey, Reginald Denny, and Benita Granville. Yep, it's a honey of a musical. You'll adore Song of the Open Road, a sweetheart of a picture.
Here's your chance to see one of the brightest film musicals of the year. Charles R. Rogers Productions' Song of the Open Road, now playing at Lowe's Criterion Theater, Broadway and 46th Street.
Hello there, oh, today I've waited for tonight. Gee, I'll say you're looking devastating. Where we go, maybe a show. Hello there, did your mother say she'd leave a light? Tell your brother not to bother waiting. Where we go, after the show, we could meet the gang at Tony, or go for a drive. I'm only alive when we two agree to a night together. Hello there, are you ready for a lovely time? Going steady, I got a lucky lover's right to say hello there every night. Da da da, da 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 da. Hello there, how you doing? Hello there, what's a brewing? It's a lovely night for making the rounds, doing the town. Better get going before it's too late. My heart's a glowing, 'cause we got a date. We'll meet the gang at Tony, or go for a drive. I'm only alive when we two agree to a night together. Hello there, babe, are you ready for a lovely time? Going steady, I got a lucky lover's right to say hello there. I'll be ya, I'm so glad to see ya. I got a lucky right to say hello.
Remember me? Of course, the spirit of strange odors.
Hi, Mom. What you doing? Rendering fat. The government needs it for explosives. Ooh, it sure smells.
It smells, of course, because I'm all over the house right now.
Mom, can I go over to Jerry's? Well, all right, but don't stay late. Oh, Jimmy, hand me that box, the OD-30. I'll get rid of this smell quick.
OD-30? No, anything but that. Oh!
You can kill the Axis with waste fat and kill those bad odors with OD-30, the new all-purpose deodorizer. Use it in solution to vaporize in hot water, or as a rinse, spray, or sprinkle to get at the source of every bad odor.
OD-30?
Yes, OD-30.
We cover up this little gem and let it rest today, so here's the last one on the bill, where rhythm pays and pays. Well, that's all we have for you today, but be our guest tomorrow. We'll have more music for you then if we can beg or borrow. Portions of this program were recorded and transcribed. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
.30 Eastern Wartime. WEAF, New York. Here is Elmer Peterson, NBC war reporter and news analyst, to give you the story behind the latest news. Mr. Peterson.
In military terms, this is D-Day +1, the second day of the big fight to liberate France. But all day yesterday, radio went across the channel with the invasion troops, recording and transmitting sound pictures of the actual fight. The British Broadcasting Company sent along wire recording machines with 2 aerial combat units. One, the story of a Canadian transport pilot who flew in his cargo of parachute troops. The second is a recording of those paratroops singing as they are carried by plane toward the great adventure. These sound pictures of the invasion were picked up by NBC this morning via shortwave. They are presented now as another chapter in NBC's complete invasion coverage. And here is the story of the RCAF pilot who flew his paratroops to the coast of France early yesterday.
We went in to drop our paratroops, going down to less than 1,000 feet. As we made our run over the dropping zone, the flak was scattered. The stick commander, paratroops are treated like a stick of bombs, called the captain of the aircraft, an RCAF man, on the intercom. Have you any final instructions? I am taking off my headpiece and putting on my jumping helmet. The captain said, "We're all set now." The stick commander said, "Righto then, good luck." He was an Englishman. The captain said, "Okay, and good luck to you, too." Those were the last words we heard on the intercom. After that, you could hear the click of the static line as each parachute was released. We changed course. We couldn't see the men as they were dropped. All we wanted to do then was get the hell out of there. We had done all we could for them, and we headed for base. As we left the dropping zone, the flak increased, and we were hit on one engine. As we crossed the coast, the searchlights caught us. And the pilot started bound the evasive action again and got out of that one. Then the motor revved up and burst into flames, and the prop flew off like a boomerang in a great hurry. And we got home on what was left. As we came home, we saw other streams of aircraft going out. We realized that we were just a tiny item in a vast shuttle service. We had done our job.
And so D-Day, the day of deliverance, is going well.
And now, if you listen, you'll hear a good old American ballad as sung by paratroopers in their transport plane, en route to the invasion coast sometime early on D-Day.
And so the great adventure began. Our soldiers, British, Canadian, and American, are now fighting on the soil of France. They are the men who, a few hours before, had set off in a multitude of landing craft from the shores of Britain. These men you now hear singing in this actuality broadcast made in the crowded hold of one of those craft. Setting out for battle echo the confident words of the man who is now leading them in the field.
And now you'll hear a film recording by George Wheeler, NBC correspondent, from aboard the cruiser Augusta.
This is George Wheeler speaking from the heavy cruiser, United States ship Augusta. It's 3:30 on the morning of Tuesday, June the 6th. Just exactly 3 hours before H hour. H hour, as you understand, is the moment when the troops hit the beach. This is a curious moment in the lives of men. It's possible at a distance in time and in place to suppose many things, to over-dramatize the situation. You might, for example, think that there would be excessive gaiety among the men. There's not. Or you might, on the other hand, suppose that men would be sitting quietly, counting over their secret thoughts. There's not that either. There's a extreme usualness about the behavior of everybody here. I think probably it's because everybody here is well trained. There's nothing amateur about this ship. This is George Wheeler, speaking from the command ship of the American forces involved in the invasion of France. The order has just been passed to commence firing as soon as we can bear on the target. In just one moment, you are going to know what it sounds like to hear a ship of war fire with you not more by microphone than 20 feet from that battery. It's going to be a blinding flash, just as there are blinding flashes from a battleship not more than 1,000 yards off our port bow. That battleship has been blazing away for the past few moments, for the past, to be exact, 25 minutes. And we have just come into the area where we can bear on the target and where we are also within range of the target. But in this operation, since there are a great many mines in this area, and since by this time, here we go, that was a salvo of 8-inch guns from this heavy cruiser, the Augusta. Another salvo. A third salvo. Ladies and gentlemen of the United States, we are now in business. You have just heard 2 recordings by George Wheeler, American broadcast reporter with the United States Navy. We return you now to the United States.
We have just received a report, a Swiss report, quoting sources in German-occupied Milan, to the effect that a large Allied fleet has been sighted off Genoa and that a landing on the Ligurian coast of northwestern Italy is expected hourly. There is no confirmation of this report. It must be borne in mind, however, that it is entirely likely. We are now pursuing Kesselring's forces north of Rome. We have landed on the French coast, and there can be no question but what eventually Allied strategy will work into new offensives. There's also a report from London that an Allied armada, this is also a Nazi report received in London, that an Allied armada of more than 100 ships, including battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and landing craft, now are off the French port of Le Havre. Here is an indication from enemy sources of the great extent of the Allied power being assembled to continue the invasion of France. Meantime, from a Supreme Advance Command Post of the Allied Expeditionary Force, there comes the announcement that Allied troops have repulsed German counterattacks in the Caen area of France. Caen, as you know, is that important rail and road center on the Paris-Cherbourg line, 115 miles from Paris. This same report from the Supreme Advance Command Post states that all beaches now have been cleared of the enemy, although some presumably still are under artillery fire. Some of the beaches, headquarters added, have been linked up with those flanking them. At the same time, Air Force headquarters announced that during the 6 days from June 1st to last night, Allied air forces flew the stupendous total of 71,000 sorties, a dramatic testimonial to the growing might of Allied air power, the air power which is shielding our land forces in France at this moment. In those 71,000 sorties, many thousand tons of bombs have been dropped, an enormous tonnage which is indicative not only of Allied might, but also of the power needed to destroy Nazi defenses. Earlier in this program, you were listening to some of NBC's documentary recordings of the news of this historic invasion. The last record was made by George Wheeler, made on a film recorder outfit while aboard the United States cruiser Augusta. And now we have another documentary recording, another NBC exclusive broadcast. This morning, Tom Trainer of the Los Angeles Times came back to London from a European beachhead. We are giving you again his report, as first broadcast about an hour ago over the National Broadcasting Company network.
Please, Dad.
This is the Advanced Allied Command Post of the invasion forces. Part of the amphibious forces which struck at France yesterday were manned by personnel of the United States Coast Guard. Covering them for the combined radio and press global pool was Mr. Tom Trainer, war correspondent of the Los Angeles Times. Mr. Trainer has just arrived at the command post from France after landing on the beachhead with the American Army units that the Coast Guard delivered into battle. He is here in the studio to give you his eyewitness report of the invasion. Mr. Trainer.
I've just returned from France after hitchhiking on 8 ships, mostly Coast Guard. Coast Guard craft seem to be all over the channel, snaking survivors out of the water, rushing wounded to first aid, and landing infantry and vehicles on the beach. I hit the beach myself early during D-Day when the Coast Guard cutter on which I was stationed went close ashore to pull aboard some men who had capsized in a duck. They came aboard shivering and shaking with cold, and as soon as they got below, proceeded to get seasick all over the place. I ceased interviewing them at this point and asked my skipper, Lieutenant Raymond Rosenblum of Baltimore, if he would hail a passing landing craft inward bound to the beach and put me aboard. The transfer was made, and my new skipper, Lieutenant Edward Raymond of Pittsburgh, said, "I don't think we can get in. It's all these obstacles that are messing the thing up before we even get to the beach." I couldn't see any obstacles. "That's the trouble," he said. "Neither can we. The tide is running high and they're covered. Those are heavy posts driven into the sand with booby traps attached. At low tide, we can avoid them. At high tide, you see," he pointed to various landing craft up and down the beach, which had been stove in and swung idly back and forth with the surf. "They got it," he said. We prowled up the coast a mile looking for an opening, and then heard a loud hail behind us. A sleek-looking patrol craft slid by, and the skipper shouted, "Hold off. Don't put your craft ashore until you get further orders." "Now what?" I asked Raymond. "We'll see if we can get you on something smaller," he said. He got out his loudhailer and called a landing craft personnel, which was heading into the beach. Motor machinist mate John Kramer of Albany, New York, and Seaman First Class Jack Whitney of Columbus, Ohio, took me aboard. "Okay," said Kramer to Whitney, "let's go and keep an eye out for the traps." We came sliding and slewing in on some light breakers and grounded. I stepped ashore on France, walking up a beach where men were moving casually about, carrying equipment inshore. Up the coast a few hundred yards, German shells were pounding in regularly, but in our area it was peacefully busy. "How did you make out?" I asked one of the men. "It was reasonably soft," he said. "The Germans had some machine gun posts and some high-velocity guns on the palisades and made it a little hot at first. They waited until the landing craft dropped their ramps, then opened up on them while the men were still inside. In a few cases, we took heavy casualties. Then the Navy went to work on the German guns, and it wasn't long before they were quiet." The general lack of fortifications at this point was astonishing. The barbed wire consisted of 4 single strands, such as we use at home to fence in cattle. A man could get through by pushing down on one wire and lifting up on another, providing they weren't booby trapped.
The engineers and beach battalions, however, had blown gaps in the wire through which we could move vehicles. A few dead lay about, and some wounded were here and there on stretchers awaiting transfer to ships at sea. All up and down the broad beach, as far as I could see, men, jeeps, bulldozers, and other equipment were moving about like ants. A few columns of black, greasy smoke marked equipment which had been hit by shell fire and set afire. The German shelling continued steadily at various points up and down the beach, but so far not reached the area in which I was walking. It would work over an area, then move on to another. It was accurate, landing for the most part close to the water's edge, and I saw one small landing craft catch fire after taking a hit. Men came spilling out of it into water waist deep. From time to time, there were huge concussions as the engineers set off demolitions. The ground would shake, and the troops would throw themselves violently on the ground. I climbed a rock embankment and came to a piece of flat land where hundreds of men were digging foot trenches. When they got down about 1.5 feet, they struck water. Some of them were lying in the water, and I asked if there was much shelling. There is when there is, one man said. Right now there isn't, but when it comes, it sure comes. I asked him what German fortifications he could point out. He showed me some tunnels at the top of the palisade. The palisade rises above the beach along this stretch of coast. There were five or six positions I could make out, nothing particularly formidable. I walked over to an aerial which seemed to mark a command post. A colonel and a major were sitting beside a split trench half filled with water, and I said to the colonel, "Sir, I'm a war correspondent." He looked up from a map fiercely, and the major said, "I think you'd better stop back later. You might try going up that path there where you see those men. If you can make it, watch out for mines. It's heavily mined." A long column of men was winding up the palisade on a narrow path. They weren't moving. At the skyline, they seemed to be knotted up. To reach the palisade, I joined a column who were wading across a slough. The water came nearly to their armpits, and they had to hold their rifles and equipment over their heads. The water was rather warm, but the bottom was a slimy mess. When a man got to the far side of the slough, he would always stop in a maddening way, holding the rest of us up. We shouted angrily, but when we got there, each one of us stopped too. The reeds on the far bank were loaded with mines. One man lay at the top of the bank dead. The mines had been marked with bits of paper, and soldiers at the top advised just how to climb so as not to venture into dangerous ground. There were more dead men along the narrow path which led up the palisade. The column had stopped moving, and I began to step past men following a captain. Suddenly a voice said, "Watch yourself, fella, that's a mine." A soldier sprawled on the bank was speaking. He had one foot half blown off. He'd stepped on a mine a short time earlier. Now, while he waited for litter bearers, he was warning other soldiers about other mines in that vicinity. I can stand the dead, but the wounded horrify me, and I only looked at him to thank him. He looked very tired, but perfectly collected. "What you need is the medics," I said. "I'll try and get them for you when I go back down." "Yeah," he said, "but how are they going to get up here?" He was right. The pathway was so clogged with men and so heavily mined that it was impassable. The engineers would have to get up there first. The column didn't move forward. The captain I was following stopped, and so did I. I asked him his name, and he said he was Louis Hilly of Cincinnati. "It looks like they shell around here a bit," I said, pointing to some shallow craters. "No," said Hilly, "those are all mines. That's why we're stuck on this path." We tried to edge a few feet further forward and came to a soldier lying in the path, curled around a mine. He said his name was Private Morton Soratello of the Bronx, and I asked him if it didn't make him nervous to be curled around a mine like that. "No," he said, "I just keep clear of it and pass the word on to those behind." Just ahead of him, Second Lieutenant Bernard Flynn of Springfield, Massachusetts, and Sergeant Arthur Brown of Brookfield, Maryland, were sitting in the immediate vicinity of mines, which they were calling to attention of all who passed. "It's all right, except when a shell comes in," Flynn said. "Then you're apt to forget and fall on the thing." While we were stopped there, a squib-like report sounded behind us. I thought it was a motor going off, but Captain Hilly said it was a mine. He'd heard enough of them this day. At the top of the palisade, the knot of men had gotten to its feet, and it looked like the line might move. One man darted over the skyline, and almost immediately afterwards, we heard the speedy burst of a German machine gun, then a few stray rifle shots. The bullets cracked overhead, and everyone instinctively ducked lower. These were some troops who had never seen combat before, and the bullets must have seemed close to them, although we were 100 feet below the skyline. The line remained stationary, and I looked down on the beach and the sea. Landing craft of all descriptions were sliding in through the low surf, disgorging men who moved through the water with amazing alacrity. As soon as they got ashore and saw the men moving about calmly, they seemed to steady down and began to walk quietly themselves. I waited a spell longer, and the line didn't move, so I began to make my way down the path again. It was slow work. The soldiers were so alarmed that I would step on a mine right next to them that one man told me to walk on his back rather than step off the path.
I promised I would try and get the engineers up to disarm the mines. While I was going down the slope, the Germans began shelling our area. It was hard not to throw myself on the ground willy-nilly, but the thought of those mines kept me from it. The shells were still landing at some distance on the flat. I took a last look at the greatest armada in history before going on the flat. It was too immense to describe.
You have been listening to a recorded eyewitness account by Tom Trainer of Los Angeles on his return from an Allied beachhead. He was introduced by Merrill Muller. And now here's Don Hollenbeck.
In a special broadcast from London a few minutes ago, NBC reporter W.W. Chaplin gave us a well-rounded report on our progress in France. And Bill reports it is progress. Chaplin says the enemy has been cleared from our beachheads. But better than that, some of those beachheads along the Normandy coast have already been linked up, consolidated. To quote Bill, all the French beaches on which Allied troops have landed have been cleared of the enemy. I was just given that assurance in the great map room of the Ministry of Information, where the walls are covered not only with maps of the invasion area, but also with photographic likenesses of Allied leaders and enemy leaders, von Rundstedt, Rommel, and Goering. Chaplin reports that this is a great day in the air, too. The forces may even surpass yesterday's record of 13,000 sorties, flights by individual planes. Well, that's the bright side of the picture, and as Bill says, no wonder the Allied communique reports satisfactory progress. But on this second day of invasion, known in that map room as D+1, Allied leaders are putting another note besides optimism in their voices, a note of caution, Chaplin reports. We get that warning, too, from our NBC reporter George Wheeler, who's in the Channel now with the American Navy. As George says, we're in business on the continent and carrying the business through. But as in every business, there are two columns in the ledger, one for profit and one for loss. There will be loss in this invasion business, too. No use blinking that fact, Chaplin told us in that special broadcast from London a few moments ago. We'd only be fooling ourselves if we did. There are so many things known as imponderables, things over which generals and admirals have no control. Weather is the big imponderable. Bill says it was better this morning, better than on D-Day, but then it closed in again. The latest word Chaplin had before his broadcast was that there were heavy clouds over much of the small area that can be used for landings in France. Returning pilots also reported some icing up as they flew through the upper levels of those clouds. And nature isn't the only obstacle, Chaplin says. The Germans can by no means be discounted because they haven't yet mounted any major counterattacks. Their resistance is increasing. Some of those coastal guns, which were thought to have been knocked out in the initial attack, have been in action again this morning, and the Luftwaffe has been showing some signs of life, Bill says, and the ground fighting is heavy. In fact, now this is another enemy report received in London and relayed by Bill Chaplin in a special broadcast from London a few moments ago. Massed formations of German reserves are attacking our forces with what the German Overseas Agency calls terrific ferocity in Normandy. The Germans claim our losses have already mounted to several divisions. Undoubtedly an exaggeration on the familiar German pattern, but losses there have unquestionably been, Chaplin says, and there will be more. Finally, while German air resistance is on a small scale so far, Allied leaders in England admit that it's increasing. The Luftwaffe laid low in the early hours of the invasion, a natural thing to do with the skinny resources at Goering's command. Now that skinny reserve is being used for the German High Command figures it will count the most. There's simply no telling what the strength of the German Air Force in the West is. With all the battering of production and the heavy losses in the air, it must have shrunk to a minuscule figure put beside the stunning 11,000 airplanes that the Allies can draw on. The most optimistic guess at the time the Luftwaffe was in its flower didn't put its strength above 5,000 or 6,000 planes. If there are 1,000 now available for use on the Western Front, the German Air Force is in better shape than they have any right to be. So we can be sure that wherever Goering uses the Luftwaffe, he will use it to the best advantage. Although just here, there's no such thing as an imponderable. 11,000 airplanes is a lot of airplanes, and the Luftwaffe is engaged in a hopeless fight, although it may be a fight full of bitterness and tricks while it lasts. Now I'm going to repeat a bulletin that was brought to you a few moments before by Elmer Peterson. Here it is, a bulletin from Zurich, Switzerland. Unconfirmed reports from German-occupied Milan say that a large Allied fleet has been sighted off Genoa. The supposition is that a landing will be made on the Ligurian coast of northwestern Italy. There is, however, no confirmation of this report, and it has not been received from any other source. I repeat, Zurich, Switzerland hears from German-occupied Milan that a large Allied fleet has been sighted off Genoa. The Zurich Dispatch adds that a landing on the Ligurian coast of northwestern Italy is expected hourly. And here's a bulletin from Stockholm. Dispatches from Berlin report today that the Allies landed several divisions along the Seine Bay of the Normandy coast and by noon had consolidated their Orne River Bayou bridgehead. In other words, Berlin has now confirmed the Allied news of consolidating beachheads, that maneuver that's so important in a landing, reported by W. W. Chaplin in a broadcast from London, which we have gone over for you just now.
Thank you, Don Hollenbeck. Keep tuned to this station for further invasion bulletins. This is the National Broadcasting Company. WEAF, New York. The following program is transcribed.
Give me Cura, please.
Cura for me, too.
Yes, in nearly every drug and 10-cent store, people are asking for Cura.
Pardon me, Mr. Keach, but what is Cura?
Why, Cura is the name of fragrant, mildly medicated preparations for the skin and scalp. They've got many important daily uses. Many use Cura soap and ointment to promptly help relieve externally caused rash and blemishes.
And men find Cura ointment excellent after shaving for quickly relieving cuts and nicks. It's great for tired, burning feet, too.
I use Cura to help protect and keep my complexion lovely. And I use fragrant Cura for baby.
Friends, try economical Cura soap, ointment, and talcum. They contain valuable medical ingredients. That's why many nurses in certain hospitals use them. Buy Cura today at your drug or 10-cent stores. Just say,
"We want Cura." You know, Cura. For daily skin care.
Cura for factory rash.
Cura for skin blemishes. Cura. I hear and see it nearly everywhere. What is Cura?
Why, lady, haven't you heard? Fragrant, mildly medicated Cura soap and Cura ointment are among the world's most successful preparations for problem skin.
Yes, satisfaction is guaranteed, or Maker will refund your money if you write direct.
Friends, see for yourself, as thousands have, how promptly Cura helps relieve externally caused pimples and rashes, eases out blackhead tips, and helps bring back radiant, new, natural complexion loveliness.
Many nurses use Cuticura for helping relieve factory rash and eczema itch.
Remember, Cuticura contains medical ingredients valued by doctors.
Buy fragrant, mildly medicated Cuticura soap and ointment today. Just go to any drug or 10-cent store and say,
We want Cuticura. You know, Cuticura.
This program came to you by means of electrical transcription. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Yes, thus far. And so, in this poignant hour, I ask you to join with me in prayer. Almighty God, our sons, pride of our nation, this day have set upon a mighty endeavor, a struggle to preserve our republic, our religion, and our civilization, and to set free a suffering humanity. Lead them straight and true. Give strength to their arms, stoutness to their hearts, steadfastness in their faith. They will need thy blessings. Their road will be long and hard. For the enemy is strong. He may hurl back our forces. Success may not come with rushing speed, but we shall return again and again. And we know that by thy grace and by the righteousness of our cause, our sons will triumph. They will be sore tried by night and by day, without rest, until the victory is won. The darkness will be rent by noise and flame. Men's souls will be shaken with the violences of war. For these men are lately drawn from the ways of peace. They fight not for the lust of conquest. They fight to end conquest. They fight to liberate. They fight to let justice arise and tolerance and goodwill among all thy people. They yearn but for the end of battle, for their return to the haven of home. Some will never return. Embrace these, Father, and receive them, thy heroic servants, into thy kingdom. And for us at home, fathers, mothers, children, wives, sisters, and brothers of brave men overseas, whose thoughts and prayers are ever with them, help us, Almighty God, to rededicate ourselves in renewed faith in Thee in this hour of great sacrifice. Many people have urged that I call the nation into a single day of special prayer. But because the road is long and the desire is great, I ask that our people devote themselves in a continuance of prayer. As we rise to each new day, and again when each day is spent, let words of prayer be on our lips, invoking thy help to our efforts. And let our hearts be stout to wait out the long travail, to bear sorrows that may come, to impart our courage unto our sons, wheresoever they may be. And, O Lord, give us faith Give us faith in Thee, faith in our sons, faith in each other, faith in our united crusade. Let not the keenness of our spirit ever be dulled. Let not the impacts of temporary events, of temporal matters of but fleeting moment, let not these deter us in our unconquerable purpose. With Thy blessing, we shall prevail over the unholy forces of our enemy. Help us to conquer the apostles of greed and racial arrogances. Lead us to the saving of our country, and with our sister nations into a world unity that will spell a sure peace, a peace invulnerable to the schemings of unworthy men, and a peace that will let all men live in freedom, reaping the just rewards of their honest toil. Thy will be done, Almighty God. Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President has just led the nation in prayer. We return you now to New York.
Columbia's news headquarters in New York, Bob Trout speaking. We've heard the prayer of the President of the United States, written by the President and broadcast by him from Washington. And now, continuing Columbia's invasion coverage, in a few moments from our New York news headquarters, we shall hear from Quentin Reynolds, from William L. Shira, and from Major George Fielding Elliott. But first, we're going to switch to Great Britain, where our Columbia news staff has already been up half the night. It's past 4 a.m. in London right now, and we shall all certainly be on duty at our microphones for many hours to come. So now to Edward R. Murrow. Go ahead, London.
This is London. Early this morning, we heard the bombers going out. It was the sound of a giant factory in the sky. It seemed to shake the old gray stone buildings in this bruised and battered city beside the Thames. The sound was heavier, more triumphant than ever before. Those who knew what was coming could imagine that they heard Drake's drum and the strains of the battle hymn of the Republic well above the roar of the motors. The first communique merely announced that Allied forces had landed in northern France. We were told that the weather had been unkind during the initial phase of the operation. The attack had been once postponed because of weather and had been launched in the early hours of this morning because the weathermen said conditions would improve. And they did. We were told that General Montgomery is commanding the ground forces, while Lee Mallory directs the air offensive. His bombers put 8,000 tons onto the target area in the course of 10 hours. Soon the eyewitness accounts began coming in. Men who had been flying all told the same story. They'd gone in low, had met no heavy blast. The German fighters had not engaged. No movement was observed on the Cherbourg Peninsula. The country was scarred and pockmarked by the greatest concentration of bombs ever dropped. Early in the morning, General Ike Eisenhower had... Here in London, we were told that 4 important considerations had to be borne in mind. First, that this campaign would not be won by a single smashing blow. That it depended upon logistics, continued and uninterrupted flow of material and men to the fighting front. Second, the presence of a certain number of non-German troops need not be a source of weakness to the enemy. That these foreign elements are unlikely to cause disintegration. Third, the Allied forces could expect little aid from the local inhabitants in the coastal area. The able-bodied had been removed. The minesweepers were the first to go in, and the Navy men around headquarters made no effort to conceal their pride over the job done by the Navy. The American naval losses were very, very light, and the shore batteries near the landing point were quickly sighted. 3 American ships engaged in shore bombardment have been named. The Aurora, the Tuscaloosa, and the Nevada. All during the day, the confidence around headquarters continued, although it was recognized that the German counterattack has not yet been put in, and the German air power is being held in reserve. Here in London, the steadiness of the civilian population is one of the most remarkable things I've ever seen. Expressions didn't seem to change. People went about their business calmly. There was no excitement. Watching them walking along the streets of London, you almost wanted to shout at them and say, "Don't you know that history is being made this day? For which you've been waiting for 4 years, ever since the boys came back from Dunkirk." They realized it all right, but their emotions were under complete control. For weeks and months, the long lines of khaki-colored transports had been riding down to the coast. Everyone, including the enemy, knew what was coming. But when it came, it didn't seem to break the tension. 4 years of war had taught these people that hard work and steadiness are more important than easy optimism and exultation. There seems to be an unspoken acknowledgement that this is only the beginning of a costly and difficult operation. It has been a brilliant beginning. The airborne operation was eminently successful. Mr. Churchill, who is not given to easy optimism, made a hopeful and encouraging speech to the House of Commons. The difficulties which appeared at this time last night as formidable are behind us. He said that the operation is proceeding in a thoroughly satisfactory manner. It was a day of many speeches. Marshal Pétain issued a proclamation urging the French people to stay put and carry on with their normal jobs. General de Gaulle made a broadcast to France asking all Frenchmen to fight the Germans wherever and whenever they can. He told them to sabotage and destroy the German defenses, avoid German mobilize assistance to the Allied armies. He called upon Frenchmen to obey the orders of the French government, by which he meant the Committee of National Liberation in Algiers. It has not yet occupied sufficient French territory to make its political administration an urgent problem. But General de Gaulle has clearly indicated that he expects the National Committee to handle the civil administration of the liberated territory. A few hours ago, Britain's king spoke to the world. He concluded with these words: "If from every place of work, factories, from men and women of all ages and many races and occupations, our intercessions rise, then, please God, both now and in a future not remote, the predictions of an ancient psalm may be fulfilled. The Lord will give strength unto his people. The Lord will give his people the blessing of peace." But tonight, hope is of war and not of peace. The latest reports indicate that the situation is satisfactory, but the weather is worsening. A strong wind is blowing across the channel, and sizable waves are hitting the beaches. That will increase our problems of supply. But there is nothing to indicate that the weather is to the point where the execution of the plan is in danger. The last communique issued in London gave us no information regarding the progress of the land fighting. But the only thing that can be said officially is that the operation is on schedule and that the airborne landings were successful and that the initial landings went according to schedule. But all during the day, the Allied air umbrellas provided effective protection. Naval casualties have been light, especially when the magnitude of the operation is taken into account. During the hours of daylight, the German Air Force avoided combat. We have no information concerning air action since dusk today. Admiral Ramsey, who commands the Allied Navy, said today, "We have broken the strut and started off on the right foot." It is Admiral Ramsey's opinion that the Navy has made possible a land battle, but that there is still a long way to go before it is possible for the battle to be won. The Germans have been fishing for information all day, and the Allied command has been withholding it. In the past, the German reaction has always been prompt and vigorous. The news of the last 24 hours would seem to indicate that they are perhaps waiting for the Allies' intentions to be more fully disclosed before committing their land and air forces in decisive battle. The Germans must not only try to anticipate our next move, they must think constantly of the coming Russian offensive. During the early phase of every operation, there is an absence of detailed information, as both sides try to conceal their movements and intensity. That's what's happening tonight. The islands who landed with the assault troops have not yet reached London. But a careful survey of every report by air and naval observers reveals a strong note of surprise and amazement at the absence of the Luftwaffe in the German Navy. Tonight, a great race against time must be in progress. We are attempting to consolidate our positions to withstand the inevitable German counterattack, while the Germans are attempting to regroup their forces and prepare to strike before we are well established. That appears to be the position at the moment. When there is more news, we shall hope to bring it to you. I return you now to CBS.
That was Columbia's correspondent, Edward R. Merrill, summing up the situation as it looks from England at the moment. We regret that the circuit from London was not very clear. We trust that you were able to hear most of what Mr. Merrill had to say. Last night, during our all-night session here at these microphones, we were fortunate enough to have good quality from London, and we trust that the circuits will be clear after a bit so that we can continue to bring you reports, eyewitness descriptions of the correspondents from Britain as the correspondents return from the operations. And now we're back at Columbia's News headquarters in New York. We've been told, of course, that General Montgomery is leading the Allied ground troops who have started the liberation of northern France. Quentin Reynolds, our Columbia war correspondent, is here at our news headquarters in New York. He's seen General Montgomery engaged in the task of directing a battle, and now here is Quentin Reynolds to tell us something about the colorful general.
It seems fitting that we follow the prayer offered by our president just 10 minutes ago with a few words about the man who is leading our troops tonight, because he, too, has an amazing spiritual quality you don't often find in a successful general. I refer, of course, to General Sir Bernard Law Montgomery, leader of all Allied ground forces. Montgomery is a colorful, almost a legendary figure, but his voice is little known. Only a few moments ago, BBC carried a broadcast by General Montgomery, which we bring you now.
I want every soldier to know that I have complete confidence in the successful outcome of the operations that we are now about to begin. With stout hearts and with enthusiasm for the contest, let us go forward to victory.
Let me tell you something about this man whose voice you have just heard. The man who was called Monty by your son. I know him very well, and I'm sure you'd like to know him, too. Monty, I said, has a tremendous spiritual quality about him. He has lived an austere, almost monk-like existence. And strangely enough, the one thing he hates above all else is bloodshed. Late last September, the Fifth Army had established itself on the beaches of Salerno and was off on the road to Rome. I was with General Montgomery then, and I asked him how long it would be before we took Rome. What do the troops think about that? He asked me. Oh, they're fairly optimistic, I told General Montgomery. They think they'll be in Rome within 3 weeks or so. Montgomery laughed, and then he said seriously, if the winter isn't too severe, if we don't have too much rain, and if we have good luck, I expect we'll be in Rome sometime in the late spring. At the time, I thought that Montgomery was fooling. I thought he was merely indulging in his well-known sense of the dramatic. But 2 days ago, when our troops did enter Rome, I recalled his words. Monty had been right once more. This magnificent general who was leading our ground forces in the invasion has a habit of being right. I have never seen a general who was venerated by his men, as is the little man in the black beret. His officers sometimes resent the way he treats them. He insists upon them being in perfect physical condition, and he has been known to immediately transfer or demote officers who couldn't stand the strain of a forced 20-mile march. His discipline is rigid, even in the desert. But his men will do anything he asks because they know one thing. They know that when Monty gives the order to advance, they will have everything they need in the way of weapons, supplies, and air cover. Monty, who has a reputation as a daring, dashing, slashing sort of a general, is, on the contrary, the most careful of men. No general is more reluctant to attack unless he is fully prepared. No general is less willing to take unnecessary chances. His men of the Eighth Army, and now the American and Canadian troops who fight side by side with the British, know this. They know, too, that in any army headed by Montgomery, there will be no unnecessary casualties. Monty does not believe that men are expendable. He would rather lose 100 tanks or guns than one man. That is why the men who fight under him tonight fight with such perfect confidence. Outwardly cold, calculating, intense, Monty is human underneath his hard-bitten exterior, and his men know that. He can't fool them. They know that when they serve under him, their lives will not be wasted. Today, that should be a comfort to thousands of American parents who quite naturally look toward the coming days with anxiety. If your son serves under Montgomery, he serves under the greatest tactical general in the world. And he serves under a man who is vitally concerned with the welfare and the safety of every one of his men. Yes, Monty is human after all. I remember when I left him that bright September afternoon in Italy. He wore his shirt open at the neck, and he wore his tan shorts, and his black beret was perched jauntily on his head. He's very proud of that black beret. I was just about to drive away when he stopped me, and he asked almost shyly. He said, "By the way, I've heard a report that the girls in New York are wearing hats copied after my beret. Is that true?" I told him I didn't know. But if he performs a military miracle we all think he is capable of performing, if he beats Rommel on the continent for the third time, I think the girls of our country might well honor him by copying his impudent, defiant, jaunty black beret.
That was Quentin Reynolds. Now, here at Columbia's News headquarters in New York is William L. Shara, who has a few words for us about German propaganda, a subject to which we should pay particular attention at this point, and also a few words about the German commanders the Allied troops are now facing. Here's Mr. Shara.
The invasion was not many hours old today before the Nazi propagandists were up to their old tricks. For the home population, the German broadcasters were inclined to take a sober view, telling the German listener that this was the real thing, that the Allies were landing in force, and that there was no denying that the existence of Germany was at stake. In their foreign broadcasts, especially those beamed to England and America, the Nazi propagandists were not so careful. Having given us the first news and thus gained some credibility, they were quick to try to exploit their position. I suppose they thought they were being clever, but they really were not. For example, throughout the day, they gave many more place names of where we had landed than did the Allied command. This part of their report was probably fairly accurate. It established where the fighting was before the Allies gave it. Having done this, the Nazi propagandists then let loose with their old tricks. We knew they would start exaggerating our losses. That's exactly what they did. Though every Allied reporter on the scene emphasized how light were our initial losses. Another Nazi propaganda line broadcast all day was that we had begun the invasion on the orders of Moscow. Since the German people had been told in a great propaganda build-up that the so-called Atlantic Wall was impregnable, Goebbels had to think up some excuse during the day to explain how our forces got a foothold on the beaches and advanced inland. The excuse, emphasized in several Berlin broadcasts, was that it had always been German strategy to yield ground when that ground was of no importance, and that besides, where the Allies hit today was not the strongest part of the Atlantic Wall. Part of the German psychological war today was devoted to striking terror in the hearts of the occupied peoples, especially the French, a task in which Pétain and Laval, be it said to their shame, aided their Nazi masters. The object, of course, was to frighten Frenchmen into helping the German defense and into refraining from helping the Allies. That was what Pétain and Laval urged of their fellow countrymen. As for the Germans, they simply told the French they would be shot on sight if they went out on the streets after dusk or circulated during the day in any vehicles or even on bicycles. Some French believe that old Pétain may have a last trick up his sleeve. That is, if and when the Germans are driven out of Paris, they think Pétain may try to convoke the old chamber and Senate and try to restore the Third Republic and thus forestall de Gaulle and his French committee, while incidentally hoping thereby to save his own skin. A word about the German commanders our invading forces are facing. General Eisenhower's opposite number is Field Marshal von Rundstedt. He's 69, the oldest of the top German generals, and thus 18 years older than General Eisenhower. On the other hand, he is undoubtedly the best general Hitler has. I learned considerable about him when covering the German armies first in Poland and later in the German drive through Holland, Belgium, and France just 4 years ago. He made a great name in Poland and a great name in France and later in Russia. In Rundstedt and the other German General Blaskowitz, if not in Rommel, the Allied commanders are up against two of Germany's best generals. But as one who saw them operate in two campaigns, I imagine they're not as confident now as they were then. The opposition is different now, and so are their own once unbeatable forces.
That's William L. Shara, who's been speaking to us with a few words about German propaganda and the German commanders here at our Columbia News headquarters. A quick dispatch which has just come in from London tells us that it comes from the ship HMS Hillary off the invasion coast, and it tells us that the first ground forces to land on the French beaches on Tuesday were Americans. They went ashore at 6:30 in the morning, followed by Canadians and British an hour later. But combined British and American paratroopers shared the honors of being the first soldiers of the liberating armies from the West to set foot on French soil. They battled the Germans for several hours before the Americans made the main landings on the beaches. And now, next, we come to Columbia's military analyst, Major George Fielding Elliott, who has a few words on German defenses. Major Elliott.
You just heard Mr. Shire tell you that the German propagandists have been complaining that we were unsportsmanlike enough to attack their Atlantic wall in a weak place instead of where it was strongest and where we'd have lost the most men. Of course, this is very reprehensible of General Eisenhower and General Montgomery to do such a thing, but the fact that they have done so seems to be borne out by a very interesting dispatch about the German defensive system, which has just been received from the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. The Germans, in planning their beach defensives, left a number of fundamental weak spots. Among them, the shallow defense systems of the coastal strongholds between major ports. To all indications, the Allies took advantage of this lack of depth, that is, of these weak places where the defenses were not disposed in many lines, or rather in many systems of mutually supporting strong points, one behind the other. The Nazis pinned their Atlantic Wall defensive system upon the retention and defense of the major seaports, that is, places like Cherbourg, Le Havre, Dunkirk, Boulogne. According to German reports, Allied invasion armies struck between them at the weakest points in the defense chain, and one would think, well, they might. The Germans reportedly erected their heaviest defenses on the French side of the Straits of Dover, that is, generally in the Dunkirk, Boulogne, Calais area. Second priority was given the Seine estuary, that is, the port of Le Havre, and the other side of the Seine estuary, and the port of Cherbourg, which is on the Cotentin Peninsula. And you'll remember that the Germans are claiming that the port of Cherbourg is our immediate objective, though there's no confirmation of that from any Allied source. Other areas were developed to a lesser extent and at a later date. Well, it's between the mouth of the Seine, Le Havre, and Cherbourg on the Cotentin Peninsula that Allied armies are now reported as trying to break through, or as having broken through, the initial German front. In these low-priority areas, defenses are manned by German infantry and their supporting weapons, and their supporting weapons consist primarily of a chain of strong points sited to cover beaches and extending along the coast at intervals averaging about 1,000 yards, but they lack adequate depth. The strong points are surrounded by obstacles, barbed wire, tank ditches, and frequently by minefields, and contain machine guns, anti-tank guns, mortars, and anti-aircraft weapons. But they're usually garrisoned only by comparatively small forces, anything up to a rifle company of infantry, and the depth is not very great. That is, there are not 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 lines of these things, one behind another, but just 1 or 2 thin lines, and when that's broken through, the line is broken.
That was Major George Fielding Elliott, Columbia's military analyst. At this point, it's a bit difficult to predict just what we're going to do tonight. We are going to remain on duty at our microphones, of course, at Columbia's news headquarters in New York. We remind you merely once again to stay tuned to this Columbia station, and we shall bring you the authentic news as soon as we receive it here. Bob Trout speaking. This is CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System.
The address by Senator Tom Connolly, originally scheduled for this time, and the program with Dean Hudson and his orchestra, scheduled for 10:45, will not be heard. At this time, Columbia brings you a broadcast by the United States Navy Band. We will interrupt this program to bring you any late news developments. sail loft at the Navy Yard in Washington, D.C., Columbia presents the United States Navy Band, Lieutenant Charles Brendler conducting. And our program opens with Lucien Caillet's Victory Fanfare. The Navy Band plays Sousa's Stars and Stripes Forever. Next, the Navy Band with Meacham's American Patrol. de la Victoire, the Navy band plays the familiar French marching song, Father of Victory. Based on a familiar melody, Johnny Comes Marching Home, we hear conducting. And now, The Spirit of America. Again, a Sousa March by the Navy Band, Hands Across the Sea. The United States Navy Band is playing for you and closes the program now with Servicemen on Parade. Ladies and gentlemen, the United States Navy Band has been playing to you this special D-Day program from the sail loft in the Navy Yard in Washington, D.C. Our leader, the leader of the Navy Band, Lieutenant Charles Brendler. Program from the sail loft of the Navy Yard in Washington, D.C. This is CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System.